And the process of vipassana, which means clear seeing, means taking these objects fully without grasping. The key to vipassana is to regard every object with the same attention. The rule is no object is so trivial it can be ignored, and no object is so important it needs to be held. Then the second term of the Buddha's advice to Mogaraja was see the world as empty. So this implies having established mindfulness, having sati, recollectedness, being fully present with the object, one sees them in their own true nature, without illusion. One sees them as empty, without self-substance. This is sunya, emptiness. This is another key concept, and one that we should endeavor to understand and to penetrate the nature of the meaning. And I think it's always a good first approach to understanding what might be called the more philosophical or metaphysical teachings of the Buddha is to begin by placing them in the context of the spiritual milieu, the intellectual climate that the Buddha was living in. His teachings are ekalico, they're timeless, they apply at all times, but often the particular phrasing and the form relates to the climate of ancient India in which he lived and taught. And there was a philosophical idea in India of the svabhava, that is the own essence, the own being, that everything which exists has this intrinsic essence that is modified by various qualities. This is very parallel to philosophical idea in the West that was, I don't think he invented it, but it was formulated by Aristotle, and it came into be a foundation stone of Western thought and got into Christianity. The idea that everything has an essence and is modified by qualities. In India, it was called svabhava. And by saying things were empty, the Buddha was essentially saying there is no svabhava. Things are without substance. They're without an essence. There are only qualities. There is no essence that is modified by them. Reality is fluid and conditioned. It's contingent, it's imperfect. This relates to the other characteristics of impermanence and dukkha, which is imperfection, or subjectively it's suffering, objectively it's imperfection, provisional nature of things. And when you see any object that arises, when you see it clearly, you see its intrinsic emptiness. Nothing exists from its own side. This is another phrase. This comes from the Tibetan text. Nothing exists from its own side. This is another way of phrasing no substance, no essence. Things only exist as a result of other things. There are no standalone, intrinsic, independent units. This is the idea of interdependence, the Paticca Samuppada, independent arising. So seeing the emptiness of things is a first step to beginning the abandonment of craving, of transcending the attachment to phenomena. The first noble truth is the truth of dukkha, or suffering. And the second noble truth is the truth of the origin of dukkha, which is craving, tanha. And the most fundamental kind of craving is the craving of the mind to take objects. This is the primordial addiction. That in each moment, consciousness is seeking to complete itself and to find satisfaction by taking an object. And because the objects are inherently contingent, inherently imperfect, inherently empty and impermanent, the mind is not satisfied. It's not completed, and it immediately begins seeking the next object. This is the driving energy that makes samsara happen. Mind taking an object. And this is why we remain within the gaze of the Lord of Death. Because the objects are conditioned, impermanent, they are essentially death. But if we see them as empty, we see through them. We don't have that attachment. We don't have that craving. We begin to move towards relinquishment, abandonment, cessation. At one time, the Buddha was sitting with some of the bhikkhus in a park. And he gave a teaching. He saw in the distance, he could see some people from the village had come to gather firewood sticks. And he said to the bhikkhus, monks, when you see the villagers bundling up those sticks and carrying them away, do you beat your breast and wail and moan and cry aloud, oh no, they're taking away the sticks? And the bhikkhus were kind of puzzled by this remark. And no, why should we care? We don't mind. It's nothing to do with us. The Buddha said, that attitude you have towards the firewood sticks, you should have the same degree of detachment towards the body, towards feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. When they come to alteration, when they come to loss and destruction, you should see them just as empty. Not me, not mine. So that's a very radical degree of detachment from the five khandha, but that's what liberation is. Suffering is attachment. Relinquishment is freedom. And that comes from seeing, in the end, it comes from seeing the objects, both internal and external, near and far, seeing them all as empty, without a substance, not existing from their own side. And the final term of the Buddha's advice to the Brahman Mogaraja was abandon thoughts of self. So this is the subjective side of the previous statement, see the world as empty. Also, abandon thought of self is the subjective side, is seeing anatta, not self, which is the emptiness of self. The illusion of self is a multi-layered thing. It's something that is implicit in people's minds. There is at least two degrees. There's various other forms of self-view, but there's two principal ones. There's Sakkaya Ditthi, personality view, which is overcome at stream entry. And that is essentially a view of self occurring at the cognitive level, or the level of Ditthi, view. This is the way of thinking about the world as self and other, and seeing beings as intrinsic self-entities, beginning with one's own self. And this again we can put into the teaching of anatta. We could also begin thinking about it by putting it into the context of India and Indian philosophy at the time. A common philosophical position in India at the time was the idea of an Atman, which is Sanskrit version of the Pali Atta. An Atman is a imperishable, unchanging essence of a person. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very important Hindu text, it's described how the process of reincarnation, when a person dies and is reborn, the Atman is not changed. And it's compared to a man going to bed at night, waking up in the morning and putting on a fresh suit of clothes. The Buddha denied that there is any such thing as an Atman. There is no imperishable essence of a person. And this is something that can be approached by considering the five aggregates: body, feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are the components of a human being, and nowhere in that can you find the essence of a person. The classic example is found in the Malindapanya, where the monk Nagasena is teaching King Malinda, and the text is all in kind of dialogue back and forth. And in the section where they're talking about not self, the king asks Nagasena to give a simile. And Nagasena says, well, O king, how did you arrive to this discussion today? The king says, I came in my chariot. And he says, well, let's consider your chariot. If we were to tear it apart and put the backboard here and the floorboard there and the yoke there and the left wheel there and the right wheel there and so on, could you look through this pile of parts and show me where is the essence of chariot? And the king said, well, that's a meaningless concept. And there's some more back and forth dialogue, and he gets the king, kind of Socratic style, he gets the king to come up to make the definition himself. The word chariot is nothing more than a designation and a name for this pile of parts. When they're properly assembled, then we can call it chariot. So Nagasena says, so it is with a human being. There is just this body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And when they're all unified and working together, we can say it's a person, which is then really just a designation, just a name. But we can't find anywhere the essence of a person. We don't find it in the body or in feelings or perceptions or mental formations or consciousness. You can also see the absence of a self on a more finer grain level when we practicing meditation and watching the objects arise. When an object arises to consciousness, there is just the object and the mind knowing the object, and no third besides. Well, that's a phrase from Mahasi Sayadaw. There is just the object arising, mind knowing the object, and no third besides. The third being the self. There's nobody doing it. Right? There's just this object and knowing of the object. And there's nobody doing anything. The only reason people assume there is a self is because they haven't looked closely enough. Let's consider an update to the chariot simile. Consider not Melinda's chariot, but Melinda's Chevrolet. Say there's a fellow called Melinda who's just bought himself a new car, and he's very pleased and happy and proud of his new car, but he's completely ignorant of how cars work. He doesn't know the first thing about it. doesn't know anything about mechanics. But he's got a friend, Nagasena, who's a Class A auto mechanic. And he's showing his car to Nagasena, and he says, the car really works good. When I turn the key, the engine turns on, and just away she goes. I think I figured it out how it works. I think there's a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go. And Nagasena says, no, you're crazy. There's no such thing as a green goblin. Well, yeah, okay. If there's no goblin, then what makes the wheels turn around? Well, that's the crankshaft. Turns the axle. Oh, okay, well then the green goblin's in there turning the crankshaft. No, that's the pistons firing. Okay, well what makes them fire? Green goblin's got to be doing that. No, that's the spark plugs. Well, where do the spark plugs get their energy? Green goblin's doing that. No, that's the distributor cap. And you can go through the whole operation of the car and explain how everything works when you examine the parts and their functions and their relationships without ever needing a green goblin. The green goblin is only needed for explanation when you don't understand it. The green goblin is like the self in a human being. When you haven't looked closely enough, then you think, oh yeah, there's somebody doing it. The closer you look, the less room there is for a self. When you look closely enough, there's no room at all. You realize it's just an entirely redundant, superstitious kind of concept. It's just a kind of abstraction we put in to explain things that we don't understand. But that mental habit of thinking in terms of a self is very deeply rooted. And you can attenuate that concept by examining and thinking about the nature of a person, but it's only really completely eliminated at stream entry. Before stream entry, everyone has some degree of Sakaya Ditti. But even the stream winner still has one further layer of self-view that's very deeply rooted, is Asmimana, that only the Arahant is free of. Asmimana its translation is the I am conceit. Is not based on the cognitive level. It's not a view. The anagami is completely free of the view of self, but this is based on perception, on sanya. It's a way of perceiving the universe from a privileged point of view. This point here, this self, is the center. And it's a perception. It's not even a thought or a theory or a cognition. It's a way of perceiving. So it's a very deeply rooted sense of self. Asmimana plays out in the life, in our relationships to other beings. The Buddha said in one of three ways. Either there's the perception I am superior to you, or the perception I am inferior to you, or the perception I am equal to you. And all three of these are equally erroneous, without any basis. They're based on perception. And as long as you're categorizing beings in that way, then that's a sign of Asmimana. But this is more, I'm mentioning this more for completeness and for the philosophical rounding out of the metaphysics here. But the work, unless you're already an anagami, the work should be on understanding self in terms of Sakaya Ditti, seeing how you're trying to understand how you create a self, a view of self. And the Buddha said there are 20 ways in which beings create this view of self related to the five aggregates. So if you take any one of the aggregates, like let's take body for the example, although you can extrapolate it, you can see the body as self in one of four ways. Either you think, I am the body, or the body is mine, or I am in the body, or the body is in me. And you can do the same thing with the other four aggregates. So that makes 5 times 4 is 20. So a practical application of this, something that is a very useful contemplation, is to simplify that to not me, not mine. When you find yourself becoming attached or stuck or identifying strongly with some aspect of body or mind, to bring up the simple contemplation, this is not me, this is not mine. And undermine that sense of self in this specific instance, here and now. So it's not just an intellectual exercise, it's something you're seeing in a practical instance here and now. Never mind the big metaphysical theory, but how is it being felt? How is it being lived at this moment? You see, you're identified with some aspect of the body or the mind. You're very attached to some phenomena. And remind yourself, this is not me. This is not mine. So with the mind clarified and purified by meditation, you can turn it to examining the phenomena. This is turning the mind to investigation, the mind that has been tempered by the exercise of samadhi. Turn it to investigation, and you notice the emptiness with mindfulness, with sati, with presence. You notice the emptiness both of the objective side and of the subjective side. See the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self. See the objects as empty and don't relate to them from a point of view of self, but just of simple, clear knowing. There is the knowing, but there is no one doing the knowing. There are the objects, but they are intrinsically empty. They're intrinsically conditioned, impermanent, not existing from their own side. And this way, you will lead the mind out of the confusion and bondage of samsaric existence and craving and suffering towards liberation and freedom, relinquishment, dispassion, cessation, nibbana.
Makataya Sari Param Dadamasi.
So now we can have